should we compare, or directly associate, the Soviet Gulag with the Nazi Konzentrationslager? It's a question that could be answered with another: why limit the comparison between just these two realities? In Tsarist Russia, Conquest declares, the concentrationary universe was less crowded and less cruel than during Lenin's time, and especially under Stalin. 488 It's worthwhile to recall what Anton Chekhov had written in 1890, quote, "We have allowed millions of people to rot in prisons, to rot for no purpose, without any consideration, and in a barbarous manner. We have driven people tens of thousands of versts through the cold in shackles, infected them with syphilis, perverted them, multiplied the number of criminals, but none of this has anything to do with us. It's just not interesting." 489 unquote. During its centuries-long duration, the Tsarist concentrationary universe, that at least starting with Peter the Great, in a way similar to the Gulag, seeks to acquire the labor force necessary to development the most desolate and least developed regions, has often shown signs of extreme cruelty. A painful trail led the condemned to exile or forced labor in Siberia. Aside from being beaten with batons, many suffered mutilations of hands, feet, ears, as well as the humiliation of being branded with fire. Yes, in the 19th century they sought to end the most extreme and cruel practices, but it's a question of half measures that in the majority of cases weren't successful. 490 From all this emerges how fragile the effort is to diminish the importance of Tsarist Siberia, with the aim of isolating the Soviet Gulag and associating it to the Nazi Konzentrationslager. Yet there's another consideration of greater importance: it's methodologically incorrect to compare a situation of normality to a situation of acute emergency. Read with greater scrutiny. The comparison made by Conquest can lead to a result different from that proclaimed by him. It's only in pre-revolutionary Russia that detention and deportation by administrative means are considered a normal practice, even in the absence of conflicts and specific dangers. In Soviet Russia, however, the state of emergency has a powerful effect on the genesis and configuration of the concentrationary universe, which becomes yet more brutal as it gets further away from conditions of normality. Now it's necessary to take one step further. Aside from Russia and Germany, it's necessary to bring other countries into the comparison. A two-part function is also inherent to liberal Britain's concentrationary universe. With respect to the Irish dissidents, it was observed that between the 18th and 19th centuries, they had their official Siberia in Australia, which at least up until 1868 consumed representatives of nearly all the existing radical movements in Great Britain. 491 That's in relation to repression. But it's necessary not to lose sight of the economic function of liberal Britain's Siberia. Soon after the Glorious Revolution, there's a massive increase in the number of criminal acts subject to the death penalty. This even comes down upon those guilty of the theft of a shilling or handkerchief, or on those responsible for cutting down a decorative plant. Not even 11-year-old boys are spared. This terrorist legislation, that with some attenuation lasts until the 19th century, offers an alternative. The lucky ones will be placed in penal servitude, which forces them to work for a certain number of years in the underutilized and unexplored colonies, first in North America, and later in Australia. In other words, even in the economic sphere Australia became a Siberia for liberal Britain. Its purpose diminished to the degree that labor came in, first with black slaves, and later with the Chinese and Indian coolies, as well as other colonial peoples. 492 The British Siberia is no less cruel than the Tsarist one. On this totalitarian society, which is built in Australia while at the same time an extermination of the Aborigines is carried out, a summary is sketched out based on the available autobiographical literature and that proves to be especially frightening. Quote, at unpredictable intervals, the detainees were gathered, counted, and subjected to a complete examination, with the inspection of the mouth and anus. The food was brought to the various crews on wooden plates or on tin trays and placed before them as if they were dogs or pigs, and like dogs and pigs they had to eat it. Discipline depended on the informant. To not become a spy became, therefore, behavior that in itself was suspicious. A week wouldn't pass without complex conspiracies being revealed, with lists of names, in a competition of accusations. That trafficking in human blood was the only way to obtain absolution. The volume of information counted more than the content itself. The informants had their quotas of accusations to make and were capable of any act of treachery or blood, it didn't matter how vile or horrible. The normal relations between guilt and punishment became an uninterrupted story of sadism, whose only point was to continue the terror. Authority was exercised in an absolute and capricious way. Of 200 lashes were divided up. Those doing the whipping were covered in blood just like us. Suicide was the only way to make the suffering end for good." Unquote. In fact, suicide was not only common, but was a practice that often implicated the whole community of prisoners. Within a group of prisoners, two men drew lots. It was up to the first to die, and the second the task of killing the first, for the rest, the roles of witnesses. In this way, during the few days of traveling and during the trial, before being hanged, the murderer could enjoy the status of a normal prisoner. And this pause allowed the witnesses to catch their breath, before returning to hell and eventually attempting another lottery. 493.